Subscribe to Careerflite and press the bell icon to never miss our videos.
So, French Revolution is basically about a revolution that was led by uh, the common people of France. So, what we see is that the population of France was divided into three clear divisions. For example, the first division, France, if we see, the clergy, the nobility, and the rest of the people, and the rest. So, what do we see? This clergy means the people who were the owners of land. And the next, the nobility, were the people who were occupying the most important offices of France. So, what we see that these two belong to the higher classes, among which power was very much involved. That means they had certain amount of power with this group of people. However, the third group, that is the rest of the population, which included all other people like the peasants, artisans, the middle class, etc., they came in the third group. But the problem was this third group, they did not have any kind of powers of this society of France. But the other two classes deliberately exploited the third class. Now, when it comes to taxation, we find that this upper two classes were not allowed, or they were not meant to pay taxes, but the entire tax burden would go to the third category of population. Now, so we what do we notice is that the third group is being continuously dominated by the upper two groups. So we see that power is confined with these two groups, and however, most of the population, that is 80% of the population of France, was composed of the third group. Now, the problem was this third group were exploited, and with time they became very, very dissatisfied with the rule of France. Now, France was ruled by a monarch. Now, the monarch was again dominated, or the monarch was continuously advised by the upper two classes of the society, that is, the clergy as well as the nobility, and therefore the monarch used to work according to the wishes of the first two classes rather than the third classes. So, these people, the third group, became really very dissatisfied with the French rule, that is, the monarch. Now, in a way, what happened with time, when the exploitation increased day by day, what we see is that this people of the third group, you know, developed a kind of attitude which was revolutionary in nature. And therefore, they thought that in order to revolt, or in order to get their rights, they need to form a formal association which was called as National Assembly National Assembly, which was being formed by the third group of France. Now, under this National Assembly, these people used to unite together and thereby, go for certain movements against the autocratic rule of France. But however, as the other upper two classes were very much involved with the monarch, they were able to convince the monarch that this National Assembly would actually challenge the power of the monarch. And therefore, we see that the monarch actually goes on to ban this National Assembly. So, from this fact, what is seen that the upper two classes actually exerts the power over the monarch as well as over the entire French population. Now, then what happened? The next step was that a party called as Jacobians party they came up who represented this third group. Now, these Jacobians were working well in democratic lines, however, they were radicals. Now, the Robespierre was one of the leader of this Jacobean party. Now, it was seen that the reign of Robespierre is also called as the reign of terror in France. Now, this means that Robespierre used certain policies which were actually terrorizing the people, and therefore we see that Robespierre, the leader, and the Jacobean, the party, they got detached or they got separated from each other because of the difference of views and the difference of policies they maintain. Then we see that Napoleon comes up at the later stage. Now, Napoleon, when he comes up, he turns the administration of the France into a modern one. That means he has trained himself to be very very powerful ruler who could challenge anybody and nobody dared to challenge him at all, and he committed himself to you know uh, for the reason of France independence, or for establishing a republic of France. Now, when we see that Napoleon was ruling over France, he has changed many system of French administration, and he was also working for the people, that is the third group. And then we see that this other groups actually gets diminished in the society, their importance gets out of the society. Now, however, in the Battle of Waterloo, we find that Napoleon gets defeated, and thereafter we see that the consciousness that people of France gained during this Napoleonic era came into a very revolutionary manner. That means after Napoleon, what we see that these people of this third group, they actually works for their independence, their rights. And due to their long struggle into various phases, we see that finally France gets independence from these autocratic rulers, and the people of France, they're able to gain a Republic of France later on. So therefore we see that France gets independence from the autocratic regime, and now after this French Republic was established, people got back their rights which they'd never enjoyed earlier. So in this way, France becomes a republic. Then, after moving from France, we find other European countries who also got inspired to get out from, the traditional ways or the systems in which the people were being exploited and people were deprived of their rights. Now, similarly, after France, what we see is Italy and Germany. Now, when we see Italy or Germany, we see that these two nations were actually working for unification. Unification. Now, what does it mean? See, when we see Germany and Italy of those days, we see that lots of European powers were actually fighting among themselves for territorial expansion and also expansion of their power. Now, for that reason, what we have seen that in Germany, the whole country was divided into small principalities or small units, and thereby they lacked a sense of unity, and for which people suffered a lot. Now, for that matter, happened in Germany, there was a intense, a drive to unify Germany into a single country. Now, when we see Germany, we see that the of Germany, northern part of Germany, all the kingdoms which comes under the northern part, they, united together to bring this unification. Among, while, coming together, a German confederation was formed. German confederation was formed. Now, in this German confederation, what happened? This all these small kingdoms and also other kingdoms, they came together and they decided that we would have a new constitution which would be common to everybody, and thereby we would attain, unification later on. But there was a country called as Prussia, who was very powerful at that point of time and who was also a part of this German confederation. But Prussia, as it was very, strong by nature, it did not, accept the idea of the common constitution under which it need to work. So what did Prussia do? It did not, it rejected the idea of common confederation or common constitution for unification of Germany. So what we see, Bismarck comes up. Bismarck is a leader, commander of Prussia. Now, this person actually takes up certain military spirit in him and he commits himself to unify Germany. So, what we see, Bismarck, you know, uh, went for a policy of blood and iron, whereby he used militarism to attain unification. He believed in that. So, therefore, we see that when Bismarck's come into this kind of revolutionary attitude for unification of Germany, we see he has fought many wars for this unification work with many of the European other nations. Now, when Bismarck comes, he unifies the northern Germany. However, southern Germany was left out. Now, Bismarck was very powerful and militarily he was very much skilled, and therefore he had one more war with France. Now, this Franco Prussian War was the war that has actually led to the unification of entire Germany, because France had some kind of influence over this southern one. And when this Bismarck goes on capturing or defeating France, automatically the influence of France over southern territory will decrease or it will end. And therefore, Bismarck unifies the entire Germany into one unit. So, unification of Germany also takes place. Now, the next country is Italy. Italy is also another state of European nations. Now, what we see in case of Italy, Italy was also divided into various small units, whereby certain units were also, controlled by other European nations. So, in that case, unification of Italy was also a strong desire of the people of Italy. So, therefore, what happened? Many leaders came up. Among those, two leaders named as Garibaldi and Mazzini. These two leaders became very popular in the drive of unifying Italy. But, however, we see that they cannot or they did not attain the way of success they were working for. That means they were not able to unify Italy totally. After Mazzini and Garibaldi, we see that a person called Clever, he was the PM of Sardinia. Now, Sardinia is a state in Italy. Sardinia is an Italian unit, of which the PM was somebody called Clever. Now, this Clever also understood that the unification of Italy could take place under a regime like that of Bismarck, that is the military regime. So, therefore, this Clever also worked very much you know, by military tactics to unify Italy. And therefore, later on, we see that, due to his effort, due to the effort of this person called Claver of Sardinia, we find that Italy also becomes unified. And therefore, we see that along with Germany, Italy gets unified. So unification of Germany, Italy also took place simultaneously. Now see what happens in world history. We have seen that American Revolution, which was basically fought by the American people against British rule. Then comes the French Revolution, which was basically again a revolt by the common people against the autocratic rule of the monarch. And when we see this Italy and Germany, they were actually working for unifying the whole country into a single unit, whereby people could actually achieve their development as well as get their rights which they deserve. Now see, in all these cases what we see that all the European nations are inspired, by one another, and thereby they are able to attain different kind of, desires that they had, be it independence from colony, be it independence from the monarchical rule, or be it, getting a bigger federation whereby, a unitary spirit or a spirit of nationalism comes, whereby we see that unification of Germany as well as unification of Italy takes place. Now, after all this, what we see that, most of the European nations are, democratic in nature, and this is the time when Europe sees, the wave of democracy coming in. But what we see after this phase, market becomes very, very widespread. That means trade becomes very important after this phase, whereby all the European nations were busy, making new products, and therefore we see lots of industries coming up, lots of industries coming up in Europe. Now with this industries, however, if you see the map of Europe, it is a very small geographical place where not a huge population is resident of Europe. So what we see with the coming of industries, we see a lot of production taking place in Europe of different commodities. But however, if you see the population of Europe, it was not that huge. And therefore, whatever they produced, there was always a surplus of it, means the additional amount which is left out after satisfying or fulfilling the needs of the existing population. So the surplus was always there out of production. Now see, this surplus actually has led to the other phenomena of history. Now if your home country is satisfied with whatever you have produced in your own country, the surplus, that is the additional amount of the production, will be left out. And when this additional amount of productions are left out, people would actually search for, different markets even out of their home country. And that is how we see that, these European nations were spreading throughout the world by taking up many sea voyages, etc., in order to find markets in the entire world for the products which they have produced in their industry in their home countries. Then, when the sea voyages took place by all these European nations, we see that lots of uh, countries comes in contact with these European nations, which also include Asian countries as well as African countries. Now, when we see this African as well as Asian countries coming up, we later on witness the phenomenon called colonialism, by which these countries went on to do trade with all these small nations, or the nations out of their continent. But what happened when they went to get more and more markets? They have noticed that this all other continental countries, that means the countries which were located out of the European continent, were very, very rich in natural resources, and also people were not very much educated. So They were not aware of the modern technologies that was happening or that was being created in the modern world. So at that point of time, these European nations, they went on colonizing these nations, whereby the earlier in the earlier times they only went to these nations for trade purposes, but later on it has transformed into something called colonialism. Now when we see colonialism, it means what? It does not mean that the country, the powerful country is only doing trade with the weaker country, but it means that it is somehow taking a larger hold over the dominant country, that is the weaker country. So in that way we see that if we take the example of India also, we see that how Britain colonizes India in the name of trade, and later on this colonialism turns into something bigger which is called as imperialism. So we see that after this widespread industrialization in Europe, we see lots of colonialism taking place in the entire world, whereby all these European nations were you know uh, becoming very dominant over the other nations which were weaker as compared to these European nations. So what we see that colonialism emerges in this world. Now with this colonialism, what happens is that all these European nations, undergoes a intense competition among themselves to capture more and more colonies in the world, because the larger the number of colonies, the more profits they could earn for their own country. So therefore almost all the European nations were having an intense kind of competition among themselves to capture more and more profits from the world. So in this way of competition, what happened was that these countries you know went for some kind of secret alliances also. That means they used to have certain kind of negotiation with certain other countries, by which they could gain the confidence of the other countries and they could rule over some other parts of the world. So therefore this kind of secret alliances were going on among different powerful countries of Europe and also beyond, in order to capture more and more profits from the world. So at this stage of history, what we see that due to this increasing colonialism, due to this increasing imperialism, and also due to this kind of secret alliances that was taking place in Europe and also beyond, what we see that militarism also comes into picture, whereby many countries were actually developing their military power, because when there is competition, when there is secret alliances among countries, obviously the automatic result would be militarism, because military is the thing which, if it is powerful for any country per se, what we find that that country could actually fight as well as win from its competitor. So military regime or militarism also came up in this world hugely. So when we sum up all these reasons, where we see colonialism coming up, imperialism coming up, militarism coming up, secret alliances coming up, now all this reason actually compiled together, and that has led to something very huge in this world, which happened in the year of 1914. What was that? That was the World War One. Now all this things has led to what we called as First World War. Now this First World War was actually between two groups of power. One was Allied and the other was Axis power. Now in Allied we see a lots of countries like USA, UK, France, etc. And here in Axis we see basically Germany, Italy, Japan, etc. All right. Now see, when we see these two groups of powers of the world, we should understand that these two groups were very, very powerful, and therefore they had intense competition or for whatever causes I have mentioned earlier. Now all this competition has actually led to this First World War. Now what we see in this First World War was that Lots of destructions take place in the world. That means the economic condition and also the social condition of the world deteriorates because of this First World War. Because this was the war where not only one country was involved, but the entire world was involved. So we see a lots of destruction, not only in financial spheres, but also on human spheres, whereby lots of bloodsheds took place. No, and there was a all-round loss or destruction that was being observed due to this First World War. Now, when we see this kind of destructions taking place in this world, so finally, what happened at the end was that this Allied power was victorious and Axis power lost the First World War. So, in 1918, what we see that the war ends. The war ends by this allied becoming victorious, and this axis you know has actually lost the war. Now what we see at the end, different scholars, different leaders of this world, they said that that lots of destruction has taken place due to this First World War, and therefore what we need, that we need to stop such kind of destructions anymore. And in order to stop those kind of destructive you know war in future, what we need a definite planning by which we could actually achieve a bigger peace in the world, rather than this kind of situation whereby unrest prevails in the world. So what happened after this 1918, uh, leaders of this allied power, they set for a meeting, and they came out with the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles, where Woodrow Wilson was a very important person who has given his famous 14 points doctrine, by this Treaty of Versailles. Now see, what was this Treaty of Versailles? This was nothing but a agreement by which peace would be maintained in the world. But what was wrong with this, which later was proved, was that by this Treaty of Versailles, what happened, many war compensations, the damage which took place in the First World War was, you know, um, planned to be compensated, planned to be recovered. But from where? It was by taxing this Axis power in the form of punishment for fighting the war. So, we see a lots of impositions were done on this Italy, Germany, etc., in the name of war compensation. Now, which made Italy as well as Germany or the Axis countries to be very, very weak later on, what we see. And all the power was being enjoyed by this allied power. So, this whole concept of Treaty of Versailles came under one organization called as League of Nations. So, League of Nations, on one hand, it was, you know, an effort to maintain peace in this world by avoiding such kind of destructive world war anymore. On the other hand, this 14 points of Wilson's or the Treaty of Versailles was also a part of that, which has actually imposed many, you know, impositions on this Axis powers, whereby this Axis powers later on became very, very weak from all these spheres, be it financial, social, cultural, and etc. So, what we see that after this war ends in 1918, we see that this Axis power, you know, are in a very, very pathetic condition. This countries. But however, what we see, these people were suffering a lot under this kind of impositions done by the Allied powers. Now, after 20 years, what we see in 1939, we see that Second World War comes into being. However, the League of Nations was created to avoid such kind of war. But what we see in 1939, we see again Second World War comes up. Now, what was the reason that this took place. Now you see, when this Axis power was being imposed a huge lot of compensation, then what happened? A person called as Hitler, and also the other person who was called as Mussolini from Italy, and Hitler was from Germany. Now these two mass leaders came out of these countries because since their childhood in 1918, when such kind of compensations was being imposed on this kind of countries, this leaders were in their childhood stage, but they have experienced all sort of humilities that were being imposed on these axis countries, and therefore when they grew up, say after 20 years, they became mass leaders. But their ways were really very violent because they believed that the independence or our dignity of our nations could be achieved only by violent means, by militarism. So everybody knows what kind of regime did Hitler imposed on Germany. So similarly, Mussolini was another leader who was from Italy. So these people actually hmm, has trained themselves to be so powerful that they were able to challenge these allied powers later on in 1939 in the form of Second World War. But however, what happened after fighting this war in 1945, we see that again the Axis power loses the war and the allied power wins the war. Now when we see this allied power winning the war and Axis again losing it, now this was the time when again these world leaders, they said that you know the destructions of the Second World War, which again took place, which again costed a lot of money and also a lot of life, should be finally stopped, and therefore they thought of reviving the concept of this League of Nations in a different manner, with a different approach, with a much more modern approach. And that is why we see in 1945, when the Second World War ends, we also see the formation of United Nations organization, UNO. Now United Nations organization is working under certain principles. Even today we see the operations are going on of United Nations, and we do not find any more wars in history till date. So therefore we can say that United Nations has been successful in achieving its goal till date, because till now we have not witnessed any third world war. So therefore United Nations was an effort to maintain peace in this world. So after this United Nations came, there was many effort in modern approach that was being taken. It clearly said that wars should not be there anymore in this world, and in order to end wars, or in order to stop wars, what should be stopped is the mutual dominations or the enmity among the nations of the world. And therefore we see that lots of colonized nation gets freedom after 1945. And so with India, when we see in 1947 we gain independence from British colonialism. So, so Indian independence, or independence of any nations after 1945, we cannot say that that was only led by the national freedom struggle that has taken place in the respective countries, but also there were international factors responsible for the freedom of countries after 1945. So therefore we see decolonization happening, whereby colonial power actually left all these colonies and led towards their freedom. So after this, what we see that the world goes for a peace treaty. But what what about this allied power, where we see this USSR and this USA? This too becomes very important power of the world. So after the end of this Second World War and United Nations coming in, we see that world goes for peace. But another phenomenon emerged, that is the Cold War between United States of America and Soviet Union. Now countries these two countries were fighting Cold War among themselves, and the reason of their fight was to become hegemon. Hegemon means sole power of the world. That means they wanted to be the world leader, both of them. So they went for something called Cold War. Now, when I say Cold War, it means what? There is no hot war. That means there is no direct confrontation, but indirectly they were fighting among themselves, and intensely they were what they were doing. They were trying to become the world hegemon. So a invisible competition was going on between USA and USSR. So therefore, we see NATO coming up for US, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and for USSR we see this Warsaw Pact coming up. Now, all these were, political organizations under each pole, whereby they were trying to get support of the smaller countries of the world, so that they could become hegemon. Because the more the support they could, actually capture from the world, the more powerful they could be, and therefore they could be the hegemon. So there was an intense, effort of both USA as well as USSR to bring more and more countries under their grip, because that was the position when lots of countries were decolonized. And because, as if you take the example of India, what we see that after colonization, after 1947, what we have seen, the condition of India was very, very weak in terms of economic conditions. So what happened? So people, or the countries which were freshly independent, they needed money for their development, and these powers, they had money. What they needed support. So there was a mutual coordination and also mutual benefit involved between this world powers and the newly independent nations, and therefore an effort was continuously made to bring more and more countries under their control. So you see what happened at this position. Lots of countries sided with NATO, lots of countries sided with USSR. So a bipolar world was existent in this world during this period, but the effort was to become unipolar, whereby only one power would actually grow. But with these wars going on, what we see that India, suppose if we take the example of India, we see that India neither followed USSR nor followed USA. What did it do? It went for policy called NAM, which was headed by Jawaharlal Nehru. NAM means non-aligned movement. That means, according to NAM, what is it is that India won't be enemy to either of them, or India won't support either US or USSR in terms of military support. But if something constructive is being done by USA or USSR, India would be a part of both. I mean, India would be friendly to both, but not enemy to either of them. Are you getting my point? So, NAM means, non-aligned movement. Now, in this race, we see that many small countries or many newly independent countries actually join hands with Nehru and becomes a part of NAM. So we see that India was neutral. It sided with neither of them. So what we see, all these phenomena were taking place till 1991. In 1991, what happened? USSR breaks down. It disintegrates due to its internal politics. It breaks up into units. Now, when USSR breaks up, what happens to US? It becomes a unipolar world, unipolar hegemon. Means what? This was the time when it actually, you know, fulfills its dream of being a unipolar power. Now USA becomes the sole power. But with 1991, when it becomes a unipolar hegemon, what happens was that the concept called as localization, liberalization, privatization, globalization, these things, comes up in this world. So with larger globalization, what we see was that world became multipolar, where we see also China coming up as a great power, Japan coming out as a great power. Even today India is also one of the emerging economies. So we see that this bipolar, we see uh, a transformation to unipolar. And then in today's world, what we see that we do not have a unipolar power which is dominant over the countries, but what we observe is that a multipolar world whereby many countries has come up to be very powerful powers, and also the emergence of nuclear power in the world by many powerful countries including India has been one of the factor that has actually helped to maintain the balance of power of the world. So uh, while reading world history, we have come to know many phenomena, and what we have seen that when we start world history, it is mostly confined to the European continent. But when we move further towards this modern world history, also what we see that all the phenomena has spread it over the entire world, and many countries has come up, and what we see that every country is affected by every other country, where we see that the process of globalization, liberalization, privatization has also come up in world history, and we see that the entire phenomenon experiences a change in the world, and thereby today we have witnessed what a multipolar world where we see that many powers are becoming powerful and not only one power. So thank you so much for watching this video. So if you like it, please subscribe to this channel as well as share it to your friends. So thank you so much. We'll meet you next.